Hello, and welcome to the Explosiveness of Philemon. My name is Julian Casillas, and today we're going to dive into this letter of Philemon and what I love about it so much. We have Paul, the writer of this letter, in a Roman jail about 61 to 63 CE. And in this jail, he comes into contact with a man named Onesimus. He is a runaway slave who has wronged his master. He is useless at this point as a slave. But he had become a student of Paul. He had been saved by Paul and had become a Christian. Speaking of the slave, there's the slave master. His name is Philemon. Philemon was a rich upperclassman who had a big home where he may have been preaching and using it to be his church in Colossae. He was like a fellow minister, just like Paul, preaching the gospel and the good news. We have a unique dynamic of this runaway slave and the master who had been wronged. Now, it wasn't uncommon for people to have slaves back in this time. It was actually as many as 2/3 of the Roman Empire were slaves. It's a pretty big number. Philemon had every right to punish Onesimus to the fullest extent of Roman law. So going back to Philemon was a huge deal, a big deal. It's not something that a runaway slave is like, oh, I wronged my master. I'm going to go back and see how he's doing. No. Going back to your master after being a runaway slave had dire consequences. You could have been burnt with an iron, whipped, and those are the light ones. You could have been killed for just going back to your master after being a runaway slave. Paul writes to Philemon in a strategic appeal, understanding that he was sending Onesimus back to Philemon. He tells Onesimus that yes, I am sending, he tells Philemon, that I am sending Onesimus back to you. He pressures Philemon by appealing to his sympathy in the greetings of the letter. And he also asserts that it does cost to send Onesimus back. It's not easy traveling from city to city. It's not cheap. He doesn't come to Philemon from a position of authority. No. He comes to him with love in his greetings. He wants Philemon to take Onesimus back as a brother. As a brother. Paul mentions that this is his child, someone that he has now come through together and is now a Christian, being saved from Paul. He had gone from useless to useful, and Paul explains this to Philemon, that he has become a dear brother to Paul. He now even partners with Paul in ministry, just like Philemon. Now, this is hard. He had full rights, Philemon did, to punish Onesimus, remember. This is a huge change to the Roman status quo, to the social order. Paul says he will even repay any wrongdoing that Onesimus had done to Philemon. Is that starting to sound a little familiar? In this letter, Paul didn't even preach about the death and resurrection of Jesus. Instead, when speaking to Philemon, he used his words to directly affect what Jesus would have done. This situation right now shows us in this in this letter of Philemon, that the good news is personal and will never be private. It affects us as soon as we decide to become a Christian. If a slave who had wronged his master could be forgiven, then we who have fallen short and have sinned in the glory of God, could we also not also be forgiven? Thanks to Jesus' sacrifice? If we were Philemon, are we someone who has been wronged and willing to forgive? Will we do what society has said we had rightfully had the right to do? We could have had someone who wronged us and put them to the full extent of what society said was okay. Or if we are Onesimus, will we go to those we have wronged and ask for forgiveness? Would we even be brave enough to accept the consequences of our actions and go back to the person we have wronged? Whether you see yourself as Philemon or Onesimus, there's one thing we have to remember. We are equal partners who share in God's almighty healing mercy through Jesus. And that is the explosiveness of the letter to Philemon.